So it's been a while since I've done some casting, so for any of the new subscribers that have joined and haven't seen what I'm doing, or anybody that's sort of forgotten about it, this is the setup in terms of preparing the sand. This is the mulling machine that I've sort of made up. It's just a thrasher bar that sort of rotates in there and smashes up the lumps. This is called green sand. It's called green not because of the colour, but because of the moisture content. At the moment that's completely dry. I've yet to add any moisture to it, but it can be used over and over again, which is what I'm doing here. When the sand has gone through the casting process, you end up with a lot of these hard lumps. They're sort of been temporarily baked into place by the heat of the molten aluminium going through the mould. So those lumps is what goes into the hopper up the top there, and they get smashed back up into a usable sort of fine powder sand that I can then re-add the moisture to and reuse the sand over and over again. The table that I've got there is my prep table for both the preparing and the mixing up of the sand and working out where I sort of make up the moulds. It's also a catchment table so that I can pull out the drawer that's underneath there and catch the sand that I've used. One of the differences that you may see with the stuff that I'm using is it's quite black. A lot of the stuff that you may have seen just maintains that sort of dirt or sort of sandy colour. That's because a lot of people just use the bentonite clay powder and sand directly, but mine ends up being black because I also add in coal dust into my mix. The coal dust, essentially because it's just a powder, makes the mix a lot finer than sand on its own can generally achieve. And because the coal dust burns off at the surface level, you tend to get a little bit better venting, but the burning off of it does mean that I need to top it up occasionally. So as I've said, you can reuse this sand over and over again, but over time you do lose volume of sand just through having stuff spilled out and sort of lost that way. Probably every third or fourth round of casting, you'll find that you'll need a bit of a top up. I use the coal dust, and I use about a cup's worth of each of the coal dust and of the clay, just to sort of recharge it. Then I'll sort of dry mix all that together, and then I can start adding in the water to get the content that I need so that it clumps together the way we need it to. If you don't like getting dirty, this is not a job for you. You want it to be wet but not feel wet. When your hands are sort of cleaned off and dried, you should be able to sort of go back in and feel the sand and definitely not feel any moisture on your skin. You want it to sort of look fluffy, and the other thing is that when you compress it, you want it to hold its shape, and when it breaks, you want it to have a clean break. So that's the sort of effect that we're going for. I just need to get that through the entire mix of sand. I've just washed off my hands so you can see what I'm talking about. It's wet enough that it compresses, but it doesn't really leave any real sticky residues or sort of wet residue on the hands. And that's what we're after in terms of the mix. Let's make some moulds. So at the moment this is the largest box that I've got, and it's only just big enough to accommodate the pattern piece that I'm working on. And given the size of this piece and the volume of sand that I've got, I'm going to have to cast up the two parts separately anyway, but it's at least big enough to give this a go anyway. I'm using graphite powder to dust this down. It cuts down the amount of stick that's on the pattern piece, and it helps cut in a bit more detail across the surface of the sand as well. If you were doing this and you didn't have access to the graphite powder, you can also use baby powder, talcum powder. It works pretty well, certainly well enough if you're trying to do this for the first time go. Because this is a pretty large span of sand to support, I'm just adding the board there on the back to make sure that it doesn't collapse. You can see there how it's picked up some of this area here and how it's pretty low on these bits here. That's where I might be a little bit problematic in terms of the molten metal wanting to bleed out this side. But because I've got a metal flask, I don't see that as being a major problem. The biggest thing I've got to do is get a really nice sharp edge on these bits so that when I introduce the other half of the mould, it's got something to separate from. And because this is the inside of the pattern piece, I'm less worried about picking up detail than I am on the outside bit of it. So I'm just making sure I've got a really nice tight pack around the edge. You can see here again where some of that sand is packed out. This stuff here I don't need. So I can force that down into that gap. Time to do the other half. It's pretty much used up all of my sand. I may have a little bit left over, but it's going to be a pretty tight pack. Let's see what we've got. Now, this is where you've got to be a little bit careful, because that volume of sand can collapse under its own weight. That's why I've done this one as the thicker amount of sand, and the other one underneath, which is supported by the board, is thinner. So hopefully we'll have a mould. Okay. That's pretty much to be expected. We've got a little bit of stuff here. What you've got to remember with this stuff is that you're working in a negative space. So effectively what it comes down to is it's like a reverse sandcastle. So any area like this that's left behind in terms of lost sand will mean more metal. Now, okay, I've got to cut that out, but it gives me the option to cut it out. So now that I've got the milling machine, I can run that through there and clean that edge up. And because this is the inside, it's far less of an issue anyway. So the real trick, or the more important part now, is to see if I can get this out and maintain that underlying impression in the sand as neatly as we can. So let's see how we go. Had a couple of collapse point. It's picked up the sand in that sort of really tight spot there. I half expected that to happen because it is a fairly tight area given how much sand is sort of packed in there, but that is also an area that'll be very easily milled out. So I'm still calling this a success at this stage. Now I've got to sort of tidy that up, get it as clean as possible for pouring in the molten metal. It looks like we might have a viable mould there. The only area that I'm really worried about is that in this area here, it's painfully close to the edge of the box, and I'm worried that that might be a point where it could possibly bleed out. I've got a couple of tricks that can hopefully stop that from happening, so it's a good enough mould that I'm going to give it a go and see what sort of result we end up with. So what I've got to do now is aim to get a good flow of metal that sort of encompasses everything. So these are not the sprue and sort of risers that are going to be letting the metal in. This is just more of a guide that allows the metal to sort of come in and pool and sort of spread out evenly, hopefully cutting through, and then it'll come up the riser side as well. So it's just a little bit more sort of added flow to hopefully encourage the metal to get where I want to in the mould rather than just wherever it feels like. This is obviously the other half of the mould, and now this is where I've got to cut in the gates that match up so that we get that metal flow that we're after. Okay, so hopefully that gives us what we want, sort of one hole in, one hole out, and the appropriate metal flow across everything. And we'll have to see. Give this a final blow down and a clean up. It's time to melt some metal. So the tin cans that you can see there give me an extra volume of metal that sort of forces its way down into the mould, and it leaves an area of molten metal that the mould can draw from as the piece starts to freeze and cool within the mould. And hopefully that cuts down on the likelihood of there being any shrinkage in the final piece. Here we go! There it hasn't, so it looks like the idea that I put in place stopped that. Let it cool for a bit, we'll see what we've got. That's just masking tape. You can see there where it did scorch a little bit because that's where that gap was. The reason why I use that is because once it's stuck on like that, you can wet it down and it stays quite damp, which makes for a little a freeze point, so that if the metal does make it that far out, it instantly sort of cools down and creates a block and stops it from going any further. And it looks like that's exactly what it did do. So we'll just stop and wait and let this cool until it was sort of back to room temperature, but I'm too impatient for my own good. That's looking pretty good. There's a few areas where the metal sort of bled into where I didn't really want it to be, but it's not going to matter. Like I said, as long as it's more metal and not less metal, I can work with that. So as I often do, I chose to do the more complicated part first, just to make sure that it was doable. Looks like it's come out pretty well. Obviously I've got to cut away all these flashing areas now and start doing a cleanup. I'll probably do a bit of a test clean just to make sure that everything is exactly the way I think it is. And beyond that, we've still obviously got a long way to go. I still obviously have to do the other half as well as the trigger mechanism area and all that sort of thing as well. But I'm definitely calling that a successful day, and now I can start looking at getting the other bits done. So anyway, that'll be the update for this time, guys. Thanks for watching. Talk to you next time.